The desert was silent. Not peaceful silent in the way only a place waiting for violence can be. At 2:07 in the morning, beneath a sky stripped of clouds, a Marine corporal gripped his training rifle inside a shallow fighting position at 29 Palms, California. Sweat that had soaked through his camouflage hours earlier had turned cold against his skin. The temperature had collapsed with the sun, and every breath drifted into the darkness. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound, which was exactly what terrified him. Somewhere beyond the last line of concertina wire, an opposing force was already inside the battlefield. They were not firing. They were not shouting. They were simply disappearing. The Marine would later admit that the first indication he had lost wasn't the tap on his shoulder. It was realizing he had been listening for noise. The men hunting him had never intended to make any. Those hunters belonged to the Royal Gurkha Rifles, and before dawn both sides would leave the exercise with something neither had expected to earn each other's respect. Long before that night, the Gurkhas had learned a lesson few armies ever truly master. The loudest soldier is rarely the most dangerous. For more than 2 centuries, young men from Nepal's mountain villages had chased an opportunity so unlikely it bordered on impossible. Thousands arrived each year. Only a tiny fraction survived selection. There were no shortcuts. Candidates climbed endless slopes carrying woven baskets filled with rocks, suspended from a strap across the forehead. Their lungs burned. Their legs trembled. Many collapsed before reaching the finish. Nobody screamed encouragement. Nobody lowered the standard. Those who endured eventually wore a British uniform, but they carried something older than any military tradition and understanding that patience could exhaust an enemy before a weapon ever touched him. Instead, soldiers accustomed to disciplined European warfare found themselves fighting men who vanished into steep forests, struck without warning, and refused to surrender ground simply because numbers demanded it. Victory came at a cost no planner had expected. When the war ended, British officers reached an extraordinary conclusion. Rather than destroy these fighters, recruit them. That decision created one of military history's most respected partnerships. Generations later, Gurkhas fought through the trenches of Europe, the deserts of North Africa, and the suffocating jungles of Burma. Enemy accounts repeated the same unsettling observation. The fear wasn't the famous Kukrain If. By 1996, another legendary infantry force was about to test itself against them. The United States Marine Corps needed no introduction. Iwo Wood, Iwo Jima, Chosin Reservoir. Its own history had been written in blood. The Marines arriving at 20-9 Palms were not arrogant. They were professionals. Many had heard stories about Gurkhas, but stories are easy to dismiss until they begin walking toward you through darkness. The exercise would simulate nighttime infiltration. No artillery, no aircraft, no overwhelming technological advantage. Just terrain. Discipline. Corporal Daniel Reyes, representing the experience described by several Marines who later recounted similar exercises, believed he understood night security. He had drilled it endlessly. Observe. Simple. Except real darkness changes people. It stretches minutes into hours. Every distant shadow begins resembling movement. Every rustle could be wind, or something much worse. Across the desert, Rifleman Balba Hajar Gurung prepared differently. His team wasn't rushing toward the marine perimeter. They were studying it. Nobody spoke. They watched guard rotations. They noted which Marines unconsciously favored one side while standing, which sentry rubbed tired eyes more frequently. Every human habit became information. Modern militaries often trust equipment to collect intelligence. The Gurkhas trusted observation. Hours passed before anyone moved. Then, with the wind carrying sound away from the American positions, the infiltrators began crawling. Not quickly, deliberately. Each movement ended in stillness. A boot pressed into sand. Wait, a hand advanced 6 inches. The battlefield became a contest of patience rather than speed. Inside his position, Reyes heard nothing. His confidence grew. That confidence became the opening the Gurkhas had been waiting for. When the tap finally landed against his shoulder, the shock wasn't merely tactical. How had another human being crossed open ground without existing? The question haunted him longer than the exercise itself. Yet something equally important happened seconds later. The illusion of surprise vanished. Now everyone knew exactly where everyone else was. And the Marines changed. British observers later described the transformation almost like watching someone absorb a heavyweight punch and immediately counterattack. There was no paralysis, no confusion, only aggression. Orders exploded across the defensive line. Marines repositioned. Fire teams shifted. Counterattacks formed before any Gurkhas expected them. The same Americans who had appeared vulnerable moments earlier suddenly became relentless. For the Gurkhas, this created a different challenge entirely. Winning the infiltration had been difficult. Holding what they had gained became harder. Gurung noticed something unexpected. He had assumed American soldiers depended heavily on technology. Instead, stripped down to rifles, physical endurance, and decision-making, the Marines adapted with startling speed. They learned it while fighting, not afterward. That ability complicated every plan. By midnight's end, neither side resembled the opponent they had been at sunset. The exercise evolved into something deeper than tactical scoring. Each force was beginning to understand how the other thought. When dawn finally dissolved the darkness, exhaustion replaced adrenaline. Faces streaked with dust. Uniforms damp with sweat despite the cold. The exercise ended not with celebration, but with curiosity. Groups that had spent the night trying to defeat one another now stood around water containers comparing equipment, techniques, and small observations that only professionals notice. One Gurkha quietly removed his kukrai. Hollywood had turned the blade into legend. Reality made it something simpler. A tool. There was no theatrical flourish, no attempt to intimidate. Through limited English and patient conversation, he explained that the knife mattered far less than the mindset behind carrying it. The weapon did not create courage. It merely demanded responsibility. One young Marine asked what separated Gurkhas from ordinary soldiers. Not fearlessness, control. Around that same circle, several Marines quietly realized they had heard almost identical words during recruit training. Different continents, different languages. The same conclusion. Discipline begins inside the mind long before it appears on a battlefield. British officers conducting the after-action review reached similar conclusions. The Gurkhas had demonstrated extraordinary patience, fieldcraft, and concealment. The Marines had demonstrated remarkable resilience after tactical surprise. Neither quality canceled the other. Instead, together they illustrated something elite military organizations rarely admit publicly. Every force has strengths. Every force has blind spots. The strongest become stronger only after someone exposes them. Being surprised had embarrassed him. Remaining embarrassed would have accomplished nothing. Instead, he volunteered for recovery operations during the exercise, helping drive the opposing force back from captured positions. His platoon sergeant later remarked that this response mattered more than the original mistake. Professionals decide what happens next. He had expected physically capable soldiers. He had not expected Americans to recover psychologically so quickly. Many armies collapsed temporarily after being caught off guard. The Marines became more dangerous. That refusal to mentally surrender impressed him as much as any marksmanship or maneuver. Years passed. Training gave way to real war. In Afghanistan, Gurkha units and American Marines found themselves no longer opposing one another, but serving within the same coalition. Shared patrol routes replaced simulated firefights. Shared risks replaced exercise objectives. Veterans arriving in theater often heard older Marines speak about Gurkhas with unusual respect. Not admiration based on mythology, recognition earned through experience. One Marine captain later described an ambush where Gurkha soldiers maneuvered onto an enemy flank with astonishing calm. There was no frantic movement, no dramatic shouting, only measured action under pressure. Watching them, he suddenly remembered stories passed down from senior Marines about that night in California years earlier. The stories had sounded exaggerated. Now they made perfect sense. The silence had never been theatrical. The Gurkhas, meanwhile, continued speaking about American Marines in similarly measured terms. Not as unbeatable, not as invincible. Dangerous because they refused to stay psychologically defeated after suffering setbacks. Confidence can't disappear after failure. Conviction survives it. Selection matters. But neither guarantees success. The decisive moment almost always arrives after the unexpected happens. After the ambush. After the breach. After the first plan fails. The question becomes whether individuals can think clearly while disappointment, fear, and uncertainty compete for control. That was the real contest at 29 Palms. Not Marines versus Gurkhas. Adaptation versus hesitation. Ego versus learning. The exercise produced no official champion because it had accomplished something more valuable than proving superiority. It had eliminated delusion. The Marines discovered that legendary stealth was real. The Gurkhas discovered American resilience was equally real. Both walked away better prepared for wars, neither fully imagined at the time. History oft uncelebrates victories. Professionals remember lessons. Decades later, many details of that particular exercise have blurred together through repeated retelling. Exact conversations differ. Individual names fade. Human memory always reshapes experience around emotion. One image, however, survives with remarkable consistency. The darkness. Not because darkness hid the enemy. Because darkness stripped away reputation. No medals mattered there. No famous battles. No recruiting posters. Only breathing. Patience. Judgment. Two military traditions separated by continents entered that desert carrying generations of pride. By sunrise, they carried something rarer. Mutual trust. The Marine who once believed silence meant safety eventually understood that silence could also mean extraordinary discipline. The Gurkha who expected technology to define American soldiers discovered determination that required no machine to sustain it. Neither side surrendered its identity. Neither needed to. It grows when capable people test one another honestly and recognize something familiar beneath different uniforms. Years later, visitors still pass photographs of Marines training beside Gurkhas without giving them much thought. There are no dramatic explosions inside those images. No famous speeches. Just tired faces, dusty boots, and quiet conversations between soldiers who learned that the strongest reputations are never built by claiming greatness. They are built in the dark, when someone equally capable is trying very hard to prove you wrong.